Okay, Frank.
Hi, welcome to Bar Talk. My name is Frank Bishop, and I'm the president of the Maine State Bar Association for 2022. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. We have Secretary of State Shenna Bellows here. We'll be hearing from her in a minute. Bear with me just a second. Angela, do you mind putting up that slide? So just a few Maine State Bar Association housekeeping items before we talk with Shenna. The Maine Judicial Branch announced on March 14th that it's lifted masking requirements for its facilities due to revised CDC recommendations and latest COVID-19 community transmission rates, which continue to decrease. Masks are still available in the courts, and they are still required in some smaller rooms where masking requirements will be specifically posted. We don't have any other COVID-related developments at this time. So other COVID-19 protocols are still in effect, including use of remote proceedings for many court proceedings, COVID-19 entry screening questions, maximum capacity limits in quarantine, and isolation procedures. So we'll continue to provide updates at these Bar Talk meetings as things change in the future. A few upcoming things happening at the MSBA. First, judicial evaluations have gone out by email. That's correct, Angela, right? They have gone out?
They've been going on this whole month of March.
Yeah.
And
so
if you need a link, I can send it.
So please respond to those. I testified before the legislature on our evaluations. The legislature really likes to hear from us, and we can't provide them with robust feedback unless we hear from you. So please do complete these judicial evaluations. Second, Law Day contest each year is underway. Submissions are due by April 1st. If you have more questions, contact Angela or I. The Summer Bar Conference is June 15 to 17 in Bar Harbor. This is in person only. The Harborside does not have facilities to provide for a virtual or remote attendance. So we're really hopeful we're going to be able to do this in person for the first time in 2 years. We are finalizing the content for the Summer Bar Conference and what the agenda is going to be like. So you'll be hearing more about that in the next couple of weeks. Golf tournament with the Maine Society of CPAs and Maine Medical Association, October 3rd. And then our next Bar Talk is on April 13 with Darcy McElwee, the U.S. Attorney. So please tune in for that. So I'd like to welcome Shenna Bellows. Thank you so much, Shenna, for joining us today. First of all, for our audience, can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you grew up in Maine, and maybe a little bit about your job as executive director of the ACLU.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here today. Really appreciate this opportunity. So yes, I grew up in Hancock, Maine. I went to Ellsworth High School, class of 1993, and went on to Middlebury College. I served in the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps, came home to Maine to work for the Maine Democratic Party as a field organizer, and then was looking for what was next. I had been passionate about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. As a child, I had a copy of the Bill of Rights on my bedroom wall. I'd ordered a poster out of a magazine. And so in looking at opportunities, the American Civil Liberties Union National Office, the Washington Legislative Office, after September 11th, was creating a new department of field organizers, specifically to work on post 9/11 advocacy. And specifically, we were called Patriot Act organizers. The ACLU was evaluating their prospects in the courts in terms of some of the litigation that they were involved in around civil liberties in the wake of September 11th, and decided that they needed to do more with grassroots organizing. So I was hired by the Washington Legislative Office to organize campaigns raising concerns around the Patriot Act. I went and spoke at the American Library Association and organized resolutions around the country, including here in the state of Maine, bringing together coalitions of groups like Gun Owners of Maine and the Maine Library Association to express support for civil liberties, the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment particularly. So a position opened up to be executive director of the ACLU of Maine. And I always think for all the parents out there, you can make such a tremendous difference. This is going to sound so corny, but my dad, who's a carpenter, called me and said, you know, he would call me intermittently after college and say, when are you moving home, Shen? And I would say, when there's meaningful work, when there's a job that will bring me back. And he said, the executive director of the ACLU of Maine position is open. You should apply. And I said, I'm not an attorney. This is something I'll do, you know, in 20 years. I'm not qualified. And my dad, being a little bit of an organizer himself, he had done some work on the home of a ACLU of Maine former board member. So he got his client to be willing to talk to me from the perspective of a former board member about what they were looking for in an executive director. And so I applied. I brought my organizing background. I had some fundraising experience for my work in the AmeriCorps, actually. I had done fundraising for a small nonprofit. I had experience working with diverse populations, and I was fortunate enough to be hired. And that was an extraordinary experience. I think if any of you were able to do pro bono work for the ACLU, I think it's an extraordinary organization whose mission is defense of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and civil liberties and civil rights. And I brought my organizing lens to that work. We were founding members of an executive committee. Betsy Smith, who was head of Equality Maine at the time, called me about a week after passage of a referendum in 2005, a non-discrimination referendum providing protections for LGBTQ persons in employment, housing, education, and credit, and said, would you like to come to a meeting to talk about passing the freedom to marry? And I said, yes, please. And so we worked on those efforts. This is all well-known history to all of you. We worked on a legislative effort. I see former Representative Carey on the line. He was in the legislature at the time. That got overturned via the People's Veto process in 2009, but we were on the City Hall steps the very next day after Election Day saying we're persisting, we're persevering. And of course, we brought an affirmative ballot question, a citizen-initiated referendum question in 2012, and we're successful. Also had the opportunity to co-chair a People's Veto campaign to restore same-day voter registration when the legislature in 2011 temporarily repealed that law that had been in effect since 1973. So that was also an extraordinary opportunity. So I'll stop there. That's a little bit of my bio from looking at the Bill of Rights on my bedroom wall to today. I get a thrill when I walk in to the Secretary's office. Actually, former Secretary Charlie Summers did most of the decorating here, and there's a copy of the original Maine Constitution there on my wall there, and that's pretty exciting.
So Shenna, we'll come back around to elections in a minute. As I looked through your resume, I was curious about why you never went to law school, because a lot of your activities over the years scream lawyer, and yet you decided not to. Was there a reason for that, or was it just that you were too busy doing other things?
I think that this is an opportunity, I really think, for Bar Association and engagement from the legal community in student debt support and student loan support or scholarship support. I grew up very poor. I had significant debt after college, over $30,000 in debt. And back in 1997, that felt horrifying and almost insurmountable. And so as I was thinking, I mean, obviously my passions brought me into work that touches in so many ways on the law. But back in 1997, graduate school, law school didn't seem viable. I thought I needed to go. I actually went to work for economic consulting firm in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years before Peace Corps. And then I found out that Peace Corps had loan forgiveness. And so, the first 10 years of my professional life were spent worrying about student debt. And I think that was a huge barrier. And
well, I can tell you that for many of us, that's a great answer. I myself, undergraduate, master's degree plus JD at Maine School of Law, which is inexpensive, was over $100,000 of loans. So after your experience at the ACLU, you decided to get into politics. What drove that decision? And maybe tell us a little bit about what it was like to be in the Maine Senate.
So my first foray into politics, of course, was challenging our Senator Susan Collins in 2014. And that really emerged from participation in a number of policy conversations around reproductive rights, around marriage equality, around civil liberties. And that motivated me to run. Of course, I lost very badly, but I learned a tremendous amount. I had the opportunity to walk across the state from Holton to Kittery. And then I was recruited to run for state Senate and was really glad to do so. I won in 2016, a district that voted for Trump that year and voted for me as well. And I think what's extraordinary about serving in the legislature, and I encourage everyone to consider doing that at some point in your career if you can make the time and space available to do so, is that you have that opportunity to bring forward ideas from the point of inception through the legislative process and to see those pass into law. So for example, one piece of legislation I was extraordinarily proud to introduce and have it fail in my first go around as senator, but see it pass in my second go around, was an internet privacy law to prohibit internet service providers from selling or sharing your data without explicit permission and without raising rates if you decline that permission. We were first in the country to do so. We worked with folks from the law school to really look at the constitutionality. I partnered with the ACLU of Maine on that initiative. That was really exciting to have an idea and then work through the details to ensure it would withstand a court challenge, which it did, and to protect consumers. But I think that's an extraordinary opportunity to get to do that work.
I agree. I grew up in Presque Isle, Maine, and my grandmother was in the Maine House of Representatives from 1978, I think, until 1994, until term limits were enacted. And so every 2 years we have harvest break in Aroostook County. And so every 2 years during harvest break, my grandmother and I would walk door to door across Chapman and Presque Isle, Mars Hill and Blaine. And it's one of the fondest experiences of my life, at least. So you had segued from the ACLU to politics, and then what was it that inspired you to run for Secretary of State in 2020?
I think one of the most fundamental issues of our time right now in this moment is what are we doing to protect and defend democracy itself and our democratic institutions? And that may seem like hyperbole in a place like Maine, where we have such wonderful voting rights protections. We were third in the country in voter participation in 2020. We have very high levels of voter registration and voter engagement. We are very low barriers to participation. Things like same-day voter registration that make it possible. Things like no excuse absentee voting. You can vote absentee ahead of the election 30 days prior to the election for any reason at all. And that is something that many states don't have. And in Maine, of course, it's in our Constitution, you never lose your right to vote for any reason. Maine and Vermont are the only two states where that is true. And I think it's extraordinarily important. So looking at what was happening in the national landscape, I remain deeply troubled. I think we are seeing some very significant changes in who can participate as voters in various states, and really wanted to do everything that I could to protect that. And also a commitment to try to make government work for the people. So elections was my motivating force for this, but in reflecting on the work of Secretary of State oversees, of course, the Bureau of Corporations, Elections and Commissions, Archives, and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And I think every Mainer interacts with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So thinking through how do we make government work for the people? How do we establish systems that are efficient and fair and accessible and secure? That's something that I am really passionate about. And to be the first female Secretary of State, that felt like after celebrating 200 years of statehood, that it was time to address that.
The 50th Secretary of State, but the first female Secretary of State.
That's right.
So specifically talking about elections, I know that you have an initiative that's before the legislature right now, actually passed in an LD last session. It's gotten some media attention. I think it's really important. So can you talk a little bit about the initiative and maybe more specifically about historically what Maine has done to audit elections and what your plan is for the future?
So LD 1155, sponsored by Representative Grahowski, is a bill to create a post-election audit process in Maine. Maine is one of only 6 states that does not conduct formal post-election audits. Now, part of that is we have very low barriers to recounts. If you reflect on election history, even in recent years, we periodically, every election cycle, are engaged in recounts. And because Maine is such a purple state, because people in Maine tend to vote the person, not the party, those recounts happen in different districts, in different areas of the state, and in different races. And so I think traditionally that has been a really important safeguard. It's an immediate verification that the vote, in fact, is accurate. There are also a number of procedures. And I think this is one of the challenges right now is election administration is actually tremendously detail-oriented and almost boring if it's done correctly. And we do have amazing municipal election clerks who conduct our election under the oversight of the State Division of Elections. And our Deputy Secretary of Elections, Julie Flynn, has been doing this work for over 2 decades, 27 years just this month. And she is probably the state's foremost election expert. And that's really incredible. So what a lot of folks don't realize is, I'm going to just go into something that might make you start to yawn, but you go in to vote, right, on election day, and there's that list. And Maine has a law. You have to have volunteer election workers from both parties. So there's a Republican sitting there and a Democrat sitting there. You might not know that. And they ask you to state your name and your address, and they check you off on the list. That's the voter participation history. You go into the booth, you fill out your ballot. If you're in a town as large as Manchester or larger, you're placing that in an electronic tabulator, a machine that is not connected to the internet. It is simply a high-tech counting machine that is tested at the state level for accuracy before it is sent out to the municipalities, and is tested at the municipality level with sample ballots for accuracy before being deployed on election day. And then you go about your business. And when the polls close at 8 p.m., tabulation happens. Again, the Maine law requires the presence of volunteers from both parties, but also permits. We are very transparent. So there are observers from candidates or from parties routinely there. When I was a state senator, I had an observer in every single one of the 11 municipalities that I represented observing the count. I'm sure oftentimes my opponents did as well. And so they do the count. And then in the 2 business days following the election, the clerks have the job of one, making sure that the tabulation on election day matches the count of the number of voters that were signed in through the voter participation list. And then entering that data to the state level. So every voter who participates, that information is uploaded. We have a statewide central voter registration system. And then at the state level, we're checking those tallies, we're checking who voted, we are looking at any potential duplicates. So the poor John Smiths of the world, every election cycle, someone at the state level is making sure that, there's not the same John Smith with the same birth date voting in two different municipalities, making sure that there are no one's voting twice, and that is legitimate. And then the election is certified. And so I think people don't realize that there's such a painstaking process of checking who is voting, who is casting a ballot, do the number of ballots tally with the number of people who are being checked in. And then that post-vote, verification of the legitimacy of those voters. So this is vote verification. That's a very broad 101. I served on a national bipartisan task force of secretaries of state to evaluate vote verification and what are proper post-election procedures. And it was 4 Republican secretaries of state, 4 Democratic secretaries of state, and we were unanimous in our recommendations for best practices for vote verification. And Maine checks all the boxes on best practices for vote verification except one, and that one is a formal post-election audit. And so a post-election audit process would be 2 things. One, following an election, you would do a post-election tabulation audit, and the legislation would be to do what's called a risk limiting audit, which is just taking a statistical sample, a statistically significant sample of ballots, and checking the results against the actual results to make sure that those are accurate. And then there's a post-election process audit, which many states do as well. And that is going into municipalities and testing them on their procedures, testing them on the accessibility of the voting location for people with disabilities, testing them on their security procedures for locking up the used ballots and unused ballots and equipment, testing them on their knowledge of some of the basics of voter registration, those sorts of things. So that's what this bill would do, is set up those post-election tabulation audits and procedural audits. And I think it's hopefully something that's going to move forward. It does require professional staff. Strangely enough, the Bureau of Motor Vehicles has an audit division. We go in and audit the municipalities for their work on vehicle registration. From a public policy perspective, one would think that auditing our elections is as important as auditing our vehicle registration process.
So that LD is LD, you said 155?
Sorry, 1155.
1155. Mm-hmm. And that passed in the last session of the legislature and then sat on the appropriations table and was not funded, correct?
That's right. But the governor did include funding that would be adequate to create that audit and training division that is in the change package for the budget. So we're hopeful that the legislature will include the funding in the budget that it passes out. And we mentioned audit and training because at the elections division, we do an annual 2-day training. Our staff goes through with the clerks every step of the election process and what they're required to do. Sometimes we do other trainings as well. Actually, earlier this week, we did a cybersecurity summit for municipal clerks. Over 100 clerks participated. We did intensive cybersecurity training. But we don't have trainers that can go in and onboard a new clerk, for example, when there's turnover, or who can be like a strike team, like if there's a clerk or retirement or illness the day before an election, to go in and help a deputy clerk get ready. And so this audit and training division would both be in charge of post-election audits, but also some onboarding and training support for clerks.
So I personally think this is a great initiative, and I'm glad it's part of the governor's budget. For those of us who are tuning in, if you want to support, if you want to make sure that LD 1155 gets funded, you should contact the Appropriation and Financial Affairs Committee. If you just Google Maine Appropriations Committee, the list of folks who are on that committee come up, including their email addresses. And it's really easy to just click on all those links. You can put it in an email and you can send it to them. And Shenna can tell you that legislators read emails from their constituents. I frequently do this, probably to an annoying level, but you'll get responses as well. So don't be afraid to support this initiative, because I think it's a good one. Shenna, one other thing I wanted to talk to you about since we have a bunch of lawyers here in front of a bunch of lawyers right now, is ideas about things that lawyers can do to support free, fair, and accurate elections. So I, for instance, have worked for a political party doing in a recount type of scenario, which was fascinating. I was on the Democratic side. There was in both instances, and there was a Republican representative, and we would go through and review these ballots where people make very strange decisions, make all kinds of odd marks, and it was very collegial actually between the two of us, and we're able to resolve it. So that's one example. But what are ways that lawyers can participate in the elections process to make sure that what we have is a good process?
Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned, getting connected with the parties or candidates to support their efforts in terms of any recounts or challenges. For example, there's a process in Maine law to challenge a candidate's legitimacy on the ballot. And as Secretary of State, I oversee those hearings as the hearings officer. But ideally, those parties are represented when they're coming before us in a challenge hearing. We have one coming up on Monday, for example. But I think most importantly, and you don't necessarily need to be a lawyer to do this, but I think that lawyers really have some unique and really important skills. And that is, we need poll workers. We need people to participate on election day to administer the elections. For better or worse, while we have, the professional election clerks, a lot of the roles on election day are volunteer roles. And I think particularly in an era of heightened controversy or sometimes public distrust of the process, I think having that sort of analytical, cool skills that lawyers have can be really useful. So I think, signing up for a shift as poll workers, or then also I know the advocates, when I was at the ACLU, we ran an election protection hotline so that if there were problems with someone being able to properly exercise their right to vote, there was an election protection hotline, and the voter could contact the advocates, and there were pro bono attorneys ready to jump into action. I'm really pleased to say that I don't think that happened. Usually that is resolved in a phone call, but not always. So for example, take in 2020, you have this pandemic, and it exposed a real problem with how people with print disabilities, people who are legally blind, could participate if they didn't want to vote in person. And actually, the Secretary of State got sued by Disability Rights Maine, representing some clients, and put into place a new system of accessible ballots for people with print disabilities. So I digress a little bit, but I think, defending the right to vote through advocacy organizations of people who are particularly marginalized populations, and then, but most importantly, from my perspective, volunteering at the polls on election day.
And if people want to volunteer at the polls, should they contact their municipality, or is that through Secretary?
Contact their clerk, and the clerks, have definitely reiterated over and over again, please, Secretary, recruit as many people as possible, because they really struggle to find people, and to find people from both political parties is really important.
So folks, volunteer, please.
Yes, that's the call to action today. Become a poll worker just once. And then I think what's also powerful about that is if you're a poll worker, you can directly, with firsthand experience, explain the boring and routine processes that go into vote verification, and that are really the underpinnings of the integrity of the process. I think our transparency is our biggest tool in confronting the lies about our election processes that are really undermining trust in democracy and manifesting themselves in dangerous threats against election officials and the like.
That is very well said. We're running out of time, but if you don't mind staying a little bit longer, I wanted to just allow you to talk about, I know you have two major initiatives as Secretary of State that you talked about when you were running. I don't want to keep you here forever, but if you want to just touch upon what those two are so people are informed, this is a good opportunity.
So my first is diversity, equity, and inclusion, making the department more representative. We've hired a Deputy Secretary of State for Equity and Inclusion to oversee training initiatives and thinking about recruitment and retention. I know the Bar Association is working on similar things. I think that is extraordinarily important. And the second, and this is my opportunity to say thank you to Angela. Thank you. I think I saw Paul Chaikin on here as well, is technology modernization to better serve the people of Maine. How do we leverage technology to improve services? So one example is remote online notarization. The legislature tasked us with creating a remote online notarization working group. And we went through this working group. Angela served on it, Paul served on it. There were 26 members of it. We met 8 times for at least 2 hours per meeting and took the time to go through RELONA, the revised uniform law on notarial acts at the federal level to evaluate what was applicable to Maine, what needed to change in Maine law. And we brought forward legislation to the Judiciary Committee, which passed out of committee earlier this week. And the work that lawyers brought to that in thinking through that interplay between the federal recommendations, existing state statute, and what it would look like as applied, I think is extraordinarily important. So my other call to action is the legislature is often tasking agencies with forming working groups to evaluate updates and changes to various laws and using your personal area of expertise to get involved. If you're interested in those types of working groups, I'm sure Angela can help connect you to some of them. Your legislator can help you connect you to some of them. But as an agency head, a department head, I have to say the participation of the bar in that particular process was extraordinarily important. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And so for those who are members of the Maine State Bar Association, we've been covering this in our legislative updates each week. I'm actually looking for it right now. You don't happen to know that LD offhand, do you?
Oh, I think it's 2023. And let me just verify that that's correct.
And did that pass?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so this is LD 2023?
That's right.
And this passed unanimously before the Judiciary Committee?
No, our stakeholder group was unanimous in most of the recommendations and in urging passage of the legislation. You know, sometimes the legislature gets funny, especially in an election year, especially near the end of session. So unfortunately, I think politics interfered with the unanimous report. It was bipartisan though. So we did get bipartisan support, which was really exciting. I'm hopeful this won't be super controversial on the floor. You know, again, this is about thinking through how do we update our laws to incorporate a new technology to allow remote notarization. Shouldn't be a partisan issue, but sometimes things get crazy in the legislature.
So if folks want to educate themselves about this remote notarization law, you can go, if you just type in Maine legislature, there's a line that allows you to put in the number for the LD. You just type in LD 2023. You can read the bill, any amendments, any testimony. You can read the minority report if there is one. I'm not sure if there is yet. But again, this is an example of how you can advocate for something that you think is a good idea. So members of the legislature, yeah.
The Maine State Bar Association testimony is also on our website in support of that.
In favor of the bill.
Yes.
Yeah. So please support getting LD 2023 passed. Shenna, thank you so much for joining us today and even going over our allotted time. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. We'll see you on April 13th when we talk to U.S. Attorney Darcy McElwee. Have a great day.
Thank you, Secretary. We appreciate it.
Bye.